Hello, this is Dr. Martin, and today I want to probe into the arrest of Brian Christopher Kohberger, who is charged with the quadruple murder of 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho. My purpose for reviewing this case was sparked by some of Brian Christopher Kohberger's background, which I'll get to shortly. I'll start by offering some background information on the murder that occurred on November 13th in Moscow, Idaho. Then I'll review what we know so far about the background of Brian Christopher Kohberger, and then we'll discuss some of his background that I have found interesting. If you find this video to be interesting or informative, please consider liking it and subscribing to my channel. Also, please consider leaving your comments in the discussion below. I'm always interested in reading your thoughts and insight into the subject matter. On November 13th, 2022, sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, 4 college students were murdered in an off-campus apartment house near the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. The students, 3 women and 1 man, were stabbed to death. The police investigation, which followed, generated a significant amount of interest from the public and led to more than 19,000 tips. Very little information was released during the early stage of the investigation, leaving some people worried that the police had done a poor job evaluating the crime scene or were simply over their head given the enormity and complexity of the crime. Many were also concerned that as a result, the killer may never be found. In fact, the majority of information regarding the murders was being communicated by some of the family members of the victims. In the apartment, the police discovered what they believed to be the killer's DNA, and there was a white Hyundai Elantra spotted near the scene of the murders. The police tracked the Hyundai to a suspect named Brian Christopher Kohberger and discovered that his DNA matched the DNA found at the crime scene. Law enforcement put him under surveillance at a residence in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. This is about 50 minutes south of Scranton. On December 30th, 2022, at 3 a.m., a SWAT team took Brian into custody. A white Hyundai Elantra was towed from outside the residence where he was staying. Brian has been charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder as well as felony burglary. The police believe that Brian acted alone. Brian remains in Pennsylvania as of today, but it's reported that he's waived extradition and will likely soon be transported to Idaho. Brian's attorney has offered a statement indicating Brian denies any involvement in the murders. Now, a little bit of the background on Brian Christopher Kohberger. Brian was born on November 21st, 1994, and was apparently raised in Pennsylvania. In 2018, he graduated from Northampton Community College with an associate's degree in psychology. 2 years later, in 2020, Ryan earned a bachelor's degree from DeSales University in Allentown, Pennsylvania. 2 additional years beyond that, in 2022, he graduated with a master's degree in arts in criminal justice from the same school. It appears Brian worked in a part-time capacity as a security officer for the Pleasant Valley School District from November 2018 through August 2021. At the time of Brian's arrest, he was a PhD student studying criminology at Washington State University. He lived in an apartment in Pullman, Washington, about 10 miles from Moscow, Idaho, where the murders took place. Brian was listed as an assistant instructor for 3 undergraduate criminal justice courses led by the same professor. The media has reported that Brian is a doctoral candidate, but that can't be accurate as he just started his coursework towards his PhD. He could be referred to as a doctoral student, but a doctoral candidate is someone who has completed all coursework successfully and is in the process of working on their dissertation. It is interesting that Brian Kohberger has no criminal record. He did receive a ticket for not wearing a seatbelt in August of 2022 near Moscow, Idaho. Here's what I've been able to learn about Brian Kohberger and some of the points I have found interesting about him. First, Brian was described by some who knew him as an intelligent person, but he was kind of an outsider. He found it difficult to fit in. In fact, some who knew him regarded Brian as highly intelligent, almost genius level by some. This probably pleased Brian, as it appears he wanted to be regarded as smart and intellectual by those around him. Specifically, it's been reported that Brian would often explain things in an overly complex manner. Brian was apparently bullied by classmates for social awkward behavior. It seems girls were often the bullies, both verbally and physically. Despite this, he demonstrated a behavior of walking up to girls, asking them if they wanted to hang out, even if they didn't know him. Now, according to one of his friends, Brian eventually addressed the bullying by becoming a bully himself. He practiced boxing and began to seek out physical altercations with others. During his time at the University of Washington, his classmates have described Brian as, once again, socially awkward and trying to fit in. He made some people uncomfortable by often staring at them. It has been said that after the murders, classmates found Brian more talkative, but he would often become reserved or quiet when the topic of the murders came up. Brian kept to himself at his apartment building, rarely interacting with his neighbors. When Brian was a master's student at DeSales University in Pennsylvania, he posted on social media an attempt to recruit research participants. He was interested in how emotions and psychological traits influence decision-making when committing a crime. Those who knew Brian academically say Brian was interested in how the mind works in relation to criminal acts. Brian may have found it difficult to understand how others felt during the commission of a crime and may have intended to use academic research to answer a question he was unable to answer on his own. Now, based upon reported profile characteristics expected from the murderer of the 4 college students, the killer was expected to be between 20 and 40 years of age. Brian is 28 years old. This profile characteristic was evidently correct. The expected profile of the murderer predicted he would be a male, poorly educated, and with little or no employment. This turned out to be inaccurate, as Brian is apparently highly educated and was employed at least part of the time during his education. However, we don't know if he was employed while living in Washington State. It was predicted that the killer would have a history of failed romantic relationships, but it's unclear if Brian ever had any romantic relationships. The expected profile also predicted that the killer would be impulsive, irresponsible, and have a long criminal record. In fact, Brian has no reported criminal history until now. The profile predicted the killer would be antisocial, but all reports thus far indicate Brian may have been socially awkward or maladjusted, but not necessarily antisocial. The profile did accurately predict that Brian would likely be a loner who at times would make people feel uncomfortable, especially women. The profile suggested Brian would have an interest in law enforcement. Brian was studying criminology and had been a security officer in the past. So this leads to the reason why I wanted to dig deeper into this story. Brian is a PhD student. It's unlikely Brian was a poor academic performer, as typically one must demonstrate some significant academic ability to be accepted into a PhD program. Having said that, PhD studies require that the student be highly motivated, maybe even stubborn, and definitely resilient. It's too early in his PhD work to know whether Brian truly has what it takes to finish a PhD program, but being accepted shows that he won the confidence of decision makers in the criminology section of the doctoral program at the University of Washington. So let's be honest, the desire to attend any college program or college course of study requires some determination. However, when one reaches the level of doctoral study, for some, that determination leads to a degree of obsession. Obsession is not necessarily pathological. If one is to endure the coursework and eventually the dissertation, he or she must have a degree of determination and grit that one could argue borders on obsession. This is what I found interesting in this case. In the pursuit of knowledge about one's chosen area of research, a doctoral student must sometimes separate himself or herself from the crowd in order to find that research question that is unique and adds to the body of knowledge of the discipline. In this case, it was criminology. I can imagine that when dealing with a science such as criminology, it must be difficult to explore the criminal mind without somehow wondering what it must be like to actually be a criminal. Studying a concept from the outside looking in is sometimes the only way, but for someone with an obsession over the desire to learn and discover new things, The obsession may perhaps cross the line. Hence, the researcher becomes the criminal in order to see, smell, and taste what it's like to be a criminal. In Brian's mind, perhaps shoplifting a bag of candy wasn't what he wanted to experience. He wanted to experience the act of commission of the ultimate crime, which is the taking of another life. He may have also wanted to experience the mechanics of the planning and execution of the crime, including the post-crime investigation. We can only guess what was truly in his mind, but it seems it's now become the duty of the practitioners of criminal science to understand Brian's motivations. Another question to ask is whether this crime was randomly selected by Brian, or did he know one or more of the victims? It's too early to tell, but it seems likely to me that he knew at least one of the victims. If he did, then his motivations for committing the crime certainly go far beyond simply a research interest. There must have been personal motivations for selecting these young people to become his murder victims, or perhaps at least one of them. Often it seems society expects ruthless murderers to be poorly educated, yet some of the most prolific criminals in modern times have considerable intellect, such as Ted Bundy, Ted Kaczynski, and even to some extent Jeffrey Dahmer. Some have questioned whether Brian Kohlberger was intent on formulating the perfect crime in order to show his superior intellect. If this is true, what would his next act have been? Would there be other victims forthcoming? Fortunately, we will never know yet how many others will observe the actions of this accused killer and attempt to improve upon his work. It's long been my assertion that most sociopaths and psychopaths are not necessarily creative or original thinkers. Rather, they observe the actions of others upon which the seed is planted, and they attempt to improve upon the actions of others. For example, I'm old enough to remember the days when school shootings simply didn't happen. It seemed that after Columbine, the seed was planted, and others built upon the horrific actions of those before them. In some ways, the notoriety gained through the media perhaps fuels the motivations of others to copycat the crime. There may be some truth to this, and in that case, the use of the accused name may be wrong. It may be the wrong thing to do or to promote. I'm not an expert in psychology or psychiatry. Being an emergency medicine NP for over 26 years has nevertheless introduced me to many troubled individuals. And my 25 years of combined volunteer and professional EMS work has exposed me firsthand to the horrors of homicide. I can neither diagnose or even speculate on the mental state of someone accused of an action as terrible as a quadruple murder. But I, like you, should take note of these events and the information gained through the investigation in order to make each of us aware that there are dangerous people among us. I believe the best course is to be kind, considerate, and caring towards others, while at the same time practicing vigilance and awareness of our surroundings at all times. I hope you found my perspective interesting. I look forward to reading your perspectives and insight in the comments below. Until next time, thanks for watching.